Hello, everybody. I hope you're having a wonderful day thus far. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar on challenging African urban visions, using futures literacy to reimagine our cities. This is part of the Building Sustainable African Cities During and After a Pandemic webinar series, which ICLEI Africa is running. And it is also part of the Rise Africa roadmap. For those who are rejoining, welcome back. But in short, Rise Africa is bringing together thinkers, doers, and enablers to promote art, creative ways of expressing, and finding other ways of knowing to inspire action for sustainable cities. Thus far in July, we focused on food. In August, we focused on SDG localization. And September, we're starting a journey to engage with futuring and what the practice of futuring, or the many practices of futuring, can mean for envisioning and making African cities. In October, we're going to look at mobility through the lens of African Mobility Month. And in November, there is ICLEI Africa's Local Climate Solutions Congress, which will take place in partnership with many exciting partners, more on that later. And in December, focusing on our nature and our cities. So for today's webinar, we have the pleasure of being joined by Geshe Karuri Sabina, who's an associate with the South African Cities Network and also on the Advisory Committee for Rise Africa, by Riel Miller, Head of Foresight at UNESCO, and Kwame Eva Feku, who's the Project Officer acting as the Africa Coordinator for Futures Literacy in UNESCO. And they're going to facilitate a journey for us to explore what futuring can mean for our cities. And I think this, while ICLEI has dabbled in work on futuring, this is in a way one of our first embarkations to try and consolidate our tool set for how we can think about futures. And I think one of the greatest provocations as I have engaged in this is futuring is far beyond visioning, but it really is about the democratization of visions and imaginaries, as well as challenging a lot of systems which give us comfort with the future, which give us security, so such as our planning paradigms. How do we get comfortable with many of the uncertainties that are posed by climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, our rapid urbanization, the current pandemic, and many personal uncertainties. So how can we use the tools offered by futuring to become more comfortable with complex systems and the uncertain future? Next. So also joining us in the room, so to speak, we have a large contingent from Cape Town and indeed South Africa, Johannesburg, Durban, Pretoria, while quite an international crew from New York, Cairo, Douala, Ekurhuleni, London, Mombasa, Pemba, Kisumu, Nairobi, Dhaka, Raleigh, Antananarivo. So welcome. We're really excited. This is going to be a slightly different form of webinar, which is going to be more interactive and really, hopefully, present to you some ideas around futuring that you can take with you into your work and practice. So we're going to start with a poll. This is something I borrowed from a colleague of mine who presents this to her Sustainable City students, to ask them, in 2050, is your city the same as it is today? Is it the same, but just a little bit better? The same, but a little bit worse? Or by 2050, have we achieved an inclusive green utopia? Or in 2050, are we experiencing a total apocalypse? So please share your perspectives. So far, what we see coming in are mostly negative perceptions. Quite a few people same but a little bit better. Give 10 more seconds, so if you haven't put in your opinion, please do so now. Okay, we can end the poll and please share the results. So nice to see that the, well, a somewhat majority say the same, but a little bit better. Some are the same, but a little bit worse, 27% of our group here. One person has said it's the same and nothing has changed. Quite a large group saying an inclusive green utopia, and 3 people saying we will enter the apocalypse. So the punchline of my colleague's perspective was saying that cities are human-made creations. And if we cannot imagine positive visions, then we cannot make them. And this was in response to many people's pessimistic or worried sense of what was coming. So how do we together develop visions which allow us to push positive images and then positive action towards cities? So we can go to our next slide. So to start us off and to draw the connections between futuring urban dynamics and planning, I'd like to invite our colleague Geshe Karuri-Sabina, can turn on video and microphone, to guide us in the first part of our conversation. While Geshe is offering thoughts, please do feel free to add comments into the chat boxes or questions into the Q&A boxes. Given that we will introduce ourselves later and discuss more later, please introduce yourselves in the chat as well. Geshe, please welcome and look forward to hearing what you will share.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul, and good afternoon, good morning, whatever the time may be where you are, to everybody. I'm really pleased to be here today, partly because I was excited to share the provocation that preceded this event. And what I'll do now maybe is tell a bit of my story in terms of my thinking and my experience with futuring around cities. And hopefully that leads nicely into what we hope to do with the rest of today's session with my wonderful colleagues, Riel Miller and Eva Cuomo. So I studied, so I'm an African, I was born in Kenya, and I studied urban planning and architecture, both in the US and in South Africa. And I got introduced to the world of futures foresight in the early 2000s. Really in the time of NEPAD. So some of you will remember that that's when there was this bold vision by African presidents about essentially regional approaches, Africa for itself, the African Renaissance, and all of this. And I was called upon to think about infrastructure and how we would think about improving African infrastructure. The urban conversation wasn't as focal then, but there were already hints at, you know, what the demographic trends were looking like. So we were looking very closely at that. But what we also began to become aware of, if we weren't already, was that the kind of traditional planning tools, which are what we would use to think about long-range thinking and planning, were really not long-range or broad enough to deal with the scale of complexity as soon as one began looking across, you know, political horizons, economic issues, social issues, technical variations. And so we got introduced to how we could use scenario planning and different sorts of futures tools, different kinds of modeling tools to look at this kind of complex planning. Now, over time, and I'll fast forward a little bit here, it became clear to me that although scenario planning, visioning, horizon scanning, all of these things added some value, in terms of the time horizon of traditional planning and that sort of thing, they really didn't address sufficiently the bigger challenges or questions that were in the next decade becoming much more acute and clear around the future of our sprawling cities and our challenged institutions, and that's just the short list. So fast forward to about a decade ago when I began working with South African Cities Network, we very much began trying to use this combination of what Leon Firth refers to as hindsight, looking back, top sight, looking across the system, insight, understanding ourselves, our behaviors, our tendencies, and foresight. So using all of that to look forward as a kind of way maybe to deal with some of this. And that's the basis for what we call our State of the Cities reporting in South Africa, and a few other African countries now do this. But largely what you then find is that it's largely reformative work. And many of us are deeply aware that looking at the fact that many of our cities pretty much planned themselves already, probably that's insufficient as well. And we really need some deep transformative work, and often we don't know what to do about that. So what I began, and I think Paul just illustrated beautifully with his image and his question, is that I began to say that I felt we were locked into pretty much 4 stale visions for the future in terms of the question of the the future of the African city. And often in a lot of typical, scenario planning work, you get into the 2x2 matrix where, you've got a vertical horizon with a good extreme and a bad extreme, and the same on horizontal. And you pretty much end up with either some fixed vision of a utopia, some fixed vision of a dystopia, so some apocalyptic future like Paul has shown us. You get some kind of disciplining future where we all change behavior, and it's not quite a happy place, but maybe it works. And then you get some usual 4th weird variation. It's always some variation on sort of Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome. It's always something like that. And this pattern I've seen over and over and over. And if we look at some of our current and recent future city visions on the continent, and not even just visions, even plans, the latest is the real life Wakanda, Akon City in Senegal. We've got the Vision City Kigali, Eco-Atlantic Lagos, Konza and Tatu Nairobi. Here in South Africa, ours are actually real. We've got Stain City, Waterfall. A lot of these places, they demonstrate, and you see it in their renderings, some inspired vision that's usually either Tuscan or Dubai-esque or Shanghai or some other green rendered imaginary, but it's something you always get the sense you've seen on a brochure somewhere, and you're not quite sure you like it, and more worryingly, you're not quite sure it works in the context and in the realities where we sit. So why and how do we get stuck into this set of imaginaries? Now, my sense is, looking to my own profession for answers, that architecture has tended to set or even limit our imaginary through particular representations and renderings of what's possible in thinking about what a city is. And then planning has drawn on that to look into how it can use its power to drive those through layouts or blueprints or rules. But often one is still just choosing between this quite finite menu of what seems possible for the future. And this, I think, is not a great, what I guess Riel might call use of the future, in terms of what many of us hope we're working on in terms of the future of the African city. So I met Riel Miller in 2014, and he'll be speaking to us soon. I'm very excited to be sharing this stage with him and the team. And the most important message, inspiration I drew from him was this idea that actually the menu can expand. That maybe that's part of the problem here, is that we're fiddling around the same menu, but that could actually expand. And that is what I've spoken to a little bit in the provocation leading up to this session. I hope you'll have a chance to look at that if you haven't. And it's the basis for my argument for what I call unvisioning the city. So this idea that maybe we need to understand and use the future differently in how we begin to engage with our work in really working on the future of African cities. So it's my great pleasure and my honor to share my story with you, but also to share this virtual stage with my colleagues, and looking at how we can go a few steps further into giving you a flavor for what does this look like, and what might it mean methodologically to use the future differently in thinking about the future of African cities. And I look forward to the process that we hope through ICLEI and RISE Africa will extend beyond this. So I'll hand back to Paul, and I welcome any questions, comments. Really glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Geshe. And I mean, for me, the provocation, is, are we recycling stale futures, has stuck with me. And this provocation of, well, how do we expand, as you say, the menu? How do we stop choosing from finite possibilities and reinforcing what these possibilities are? And in a way, start owning that narrative collectively, I think is really exciting as a possibility. So thanks for the thoughts. Please, again, for those joining us, add any comments or questions into the chat and Q&A. I'd like to introduce Riel Miller, Head of Foresight at UNESCO, to offer some provocations, as Geshe said, for how we can use the future. Riel, please feel free to share your video and unmute.
Unmute, and I'll start my video. There we go. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody. It's really, again, yes, for me, an honor and a pleasure to be with you. I'll put my screen sharing up for a second. Who can share? All panelists, it says.
Click the center of the button, not the little arrow.
Okay, you got it. Oh, you seem to know your way around this. Wonderful to be here. Very glad to be able to participate and offer some thoughts about. I think one of the really fantastic so let me plunge right into it. So Geshe set me up nicely with this idea that so that's the Expanse. So let's do a popular culture thing. I don't know how many people know the Expanse. It's a sci-fi Netflix, I think, or Prime or something like that. But it talks about basically the arrival of extraterrestrials, and that's a really common like mind-bending, imagination exploding. Let's get beyond our boundaries, think about something new. And for me, and from the point of view of the Expanse, the point is that it's just not going to be comprehensible. Period. It's just outside our ability to understand what's going on. And that same that goes for Westworld, which is not an external alien coming in, from somewhere outside the solar system to jolt our images of ourselves and the world around us and confront us with the inadequacy of our ability to describe the world. But also Westworld, which does the kind of intelligence springing from within our own products, but the thinking and the minds and the meaning and what is a sentient non-human created by humans is again incomprehensible for us. And I guess what I find persuasive and powerful here about images of the future or images of things that are outside are unknowable is that it brings us into this question of how do we live in a complex universe. Because the thing about a complex universe, which is the universe we live in, doesn't get more or less complex. It is complex. And if it's complex, that means that there are unknowable things happening and arising all the time. And so does living with a complex universe mean we want to, smack it down somehow, escape and create? Well, I don't think that option's on the table. So the question is how to get better at living with complex emergence. And in the present, there is just this repetition, things that repeat, and then there are things that are different. And this becomes the really, I think, primary challenge of living with complexity, which is to begin to get better at dealing with repetition and difference. Now, some of the differences are, I'm standing in a different place, so I moved, and I was in one place, now I'm in another. That's a difference. I'm not repeating by staying in the same place, but some differences are, I don't even have a name for this. I don't even know what it is. In fact, I can't even see it because I have no way of making sense of it yet, but maybe I feel it. And so when we begin to think about this issue, for instance, of urban change, but when we also get our ideas of the future blown away by the windshield crashing halt to everyday life that the COVID crisis is about, we realize that these our ability to distinguish and define repetition and difference, and to understand that there are unknown unknowns out there, is relatively limited and can be improved. And so that brings me to futures literacy and the question of how we can be better understanding the differences here between substitution effects, things that replace. So for instance, the stop sign and the police person who's at the intersection directing cars versus the stoplight that replaces them. The complementarity, the telephone that connects us up, but seems to be something that might replace face-to-face, but in fact enhances or enables face-to-face. And finally, emergence. Again, the issue of how to imagine that because we alienate ourselves from our relationship to nature, think we're superior to nature, we therefore don't ever think of the consequences of putting all that carbon into the atmosphere. So this is again an emergence phenomenon. Henry Ford did not think of urban suburbs when the Model T came off the assembly line and became a mass production product. But the suburb that we see there in the other picture was an emergent property. In other words, there's this continuous challenge of thinking about changes in the conditions of change. Changes within the system, what Geshe was referring to as reform, changes outside the system, things that are completely new, novel. And so we have inside-in change, outside-in change, both of which are very important. There are things that happen from internal reforms and improvements and getting better. The telephones that we use that become smaller and more efficient. The outside-in change, the kind of examples we have from other places. So for instance, outside-in change these days in education, looking at what we used to call MOOCs, and now we're just going to call, hey, this is the Zoom world for learning. Those come outside into the system. There's the inside out, and those are things that emerge and eventually displace. Let's say, mercantilism changing into capitalism, if I can use a historical long-term example, but also outside out, things that come from completely different quarters that emerge because of the creativity of our universe. And the idea here is that futures literacy is one way of gaining access a little bit better to the novel things, the things we cannot really name in advance, that are unknowable in advance. And here, the work that we've been doing at UNESCO and the work around futures literacy has to do with understanding the anticipatory systems and processes. Since the future does not exist in the present, but anticipation does, the form the future takes in the present is anticipation. And so there's the question of revealing those anticipatory systems, those anticipatory processes, the things that, if you go around and you say, hey, what's your anticipatory system? People will look at you and say, oh, what strange question are you asking me there? But we can actually explore and reveal the different anticipatory systems, like this particle accelerator that reveals the invisible atomic structure, and make the invisible visible. And what that does is it provides us with an insight into what we could call walking on two legs, which is embracing two distinct and actually not very compatible ways of thinking about the world. One is what you might call the closed systems, where we have contingent futures and the futures we plan for, and therefore we can generate all sorts of images, extrapolating, introducing random changes, being dystopian, being utopian, all of those. We can break the system, we can make it perfect. All of those are essentially preparatory or planning-based ways of thinking, what we call anticipation for the future. Then there's the other side, which is open, where we discover, revealing what we did not know we knew. This is sense-making, inventing the unknowable. And one of the ways to do that is to disconnect the way we think about the future from the current dominant way of thinking about the future, which is, what if we're using the future, in some senses, as simply a way to disrupt our perception of the present? And there, I think, when it comes to being less biased towards path dependency, in other words, in the poll, most of you said, and of course it's a completely normal proposition, that life will continue as usual, a little bit better, a little bit worse. That's the baseline way of thinking. And we mostly think about our agency, what we can do, as how can I try to impose my view of the future on the future, and kind of live with this idea that I know that in the past there have been radical changes and things have altered on a dime, of which COVID is a nice example. But nevertheless, when I think about the future, I have this kind of, and it won't be like that. It'll be just sort of some form of continuity or variation. So to get beyond that, really, and this is the paradigmatic part, is we have to be ready to imagine futures that are, I think, not about the future, but about helping us to detect, discover, tease, provoke aspects of the present that wouldn't otherwise be noticeable, and also suspend this kind of anxiety and urgency that we better plan for it, because otherwise we're going to be it's going to be game over. And it occurred to me in listening and thinking and preparing for this session that one of the most powerful processes for achieving the dominance of today's planning perspective, which thinks it can colonize tomorrow, engineer the future, is in fact cities. Because cities are absolutely, even more than, let's say, the Manhattan Project or Man on the Moon, the D-Day, the big examples of systems and operations research and systems planning. Even more persuasive, powerful, and everyday evident is planning, cities, urban planning. I live in Paris, which has the obvious Haussmann reworking of the city, but sewage and electricity and all the things that urban subways and bus routes and all the things that urban planning are about show us the power of planning to actually alter our everyday life, to impose the planner's vision on people. Although in the urban planning world, you have a legion of examples where the planner's ideas went completely awry, and makes the good point, which is necessary, that we live in this complex emergent world. So how do we live these two paradigms? How do we change the things that we fear? Essentially today, uncertainty, the unknowable, is the enemy of planning. It's the enemy of a sense of security, and it creates this anxiety that drives us, I think, to try to control the world around us. So I would suggest that futures literacy, which is a capability, makes a difference in this context. It's a conceptual difference, and this is why I would compare it to the Ptolemaic versus the Copernican perspective. If you think about daily life when you get up in the morning, or if you're a farmer, or if you're a child or whomever, where the sun actually happens to be with respect to the Earth, and does the Earth go around, or is the Earth in the center, what difference does it make? It doesn't actually make a practical difference. But we know very well that understanding the actual positioning of the sun and the Earth changed the way we thought, moving to the Copernican system. So why bother to embrace anticipation for the future and anticipation for the emergence? I think is because it changes what we see, our perceptions. It changes what we imagine. It changes what we resist. It changes what we preserve. It changes how we preserve what we want to preserve. And it changes the conditions of change. So just let me kind of emphasize the point that I think the imagining that we have today about the urban world, of which there are many, many different examples, could benefit tremendously from simply standing back, relaxing our desire to project the future, and thinking about what's around us that doesn't have a name, that could be related to a completely different way of creating value and meaning, and that would open us up to living transformation in a much more fluid and open way. And that's why I end with this slide, which is the typical image of the planner, of the leader, of what makes people feel secure is, don't you feel secure if you're following that grand leader who knows how to get from point A, one side of the precipice, to point B, the other side of the precipice? And I think you just have to look at this image from Saint-Pé and you realize that that's a completely crazy way to think about going places. So the moral to the story is how we anticipate matters. The anticipatory systems and anticipatory thinking we use, it changes the present. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Riel, for the provocations. And I definitely have the next question that I'll use this month, which is, what is your anticipatory system? But I think that's placed us nicely in this conversation, is how do we use the future to disrupt the present? And I think that's quite an exciting provocation. Thanks very much. We'll hear now from Cuomo Feku, who will ground some of this for us through an invitation on how to do futuring practically. So I'm quite excited for her provocations as well. Eva, invite you to unmute and share your screen or share your video. There we are. Great.
Thanks so much, Paul, and thank you so much, Geshi and Rial. I'm also very honored to just follow their presentation, because then it also helps me ground what I'm just about to say. Building on what Rial has just mentioned regarding future literacy as a capability, which is basically the capacity to understand why and how we anticipate. What we've been trying to do from within UNESCO is to build a framework just around that. So it's the methodological framework, how we do it, and also a thematic, a substantive framework. What do we apply it to? And I would like for you to keep that tension always in mind, because it actually reflects on the people that are directly involved in the construction of future literacy activities. Usually speaking, future literacy design principles reflect just all of those different approaches to futures. So I believe that all of you, and I'd be keen just after those three invitations that we have, we'd like to have this kind of interactive session where we actually get to hear from you. And I'll be very keen to know what kind of approaches to futures you've been exposed to. So some of you are familiar with forecasting, which is the generating predictive data, economic data, weather forecasts, you name it. Some of you might be more familiar with foresight, which is about producing scenarios around futures. Some of you might be more familiar with strategic planning, and especially as we're talking about urban planning quite a lot, with this idea that we have this idea of the future, those images of the future, and we're trying to build a series of action plans around that in order to achieve that future. Especially in African context, I speak as a Cameroonian, as we have this idea of Emergence 2035, for example, or in Kenya, where we have Kenya 2030, or in Ivory Coast, where we have Côte d'Ivoire 2040. So all of those ideas that are actually all about where we want to go to. And so how can we shape the present in order to fit this idea of the future that we have in mind. Now, what we tend to observe is not so much that we don't want to embrace those approaches. The idea is much more to take a step back and actually think about why we've been using the future all this time. What we tend to observe is, for example, that those three approaches that I've just mentioned, may it be forecasting, may it be foresight, may it be strategic planning, tend to be reserved to a specific portion, to a specific assemble of actors. We call them policymakers, or we call them specific specialists of their own field. And what we see in the construction of cities is that there's an issue both on who is actually the one to decide what kind of futures we can talk about, but also on the what kind of futures are we envisioning. And those two are actually related, the who and the what. So the design principles that we have in mind when we come up with future literacy activities are articulated around three that I'm just going to mention. One is learning by doing. So it's actually peculiar to say that as part of the webinar, but we are very much keen to actually do things, do futures, use futures, and see how we do it, and actually reflect on that with this idea that reflexivity is actually what's going to help us nurture that those kind of discussions, rather than just talk about futures or leave that in the hands of particular people only. The second one is around collective intelligence, having people together to actually negotiate meaning, share meanings. What do we mean by that? It's not about seeking consensus per se, but actually have this kind of collage of ideas and see where the overlap can be. The third one is more around what we call endogenous knowledge creation. And I'll just pause on that just for a second to talk about one project that we've been helping out in Mali, specifically in Bamako. what we tend to see is that we have this tension around knowledge itself. Who is, like, I just talked about who was the one producing knowledge, what was the knowledge in itself, but also the type of images that people have in mind. And we tend to notice that those images are really important to understand the construction itself. What do I mean by that is that there's an overproduction of used images of the future. And we see that a lot in Africa directly. This idea of, for example, development, this idea of cities, and we see that those ideas are very much fixed in stone. And it was interesting to start with Paul.
The same kind of feedbacks we have received from the cities we are working with.
Sorry.
All right, please continue.
Could you hear back directly from Ike? Paul, could you please clarify if there's anything going on?
That's okay. Eva, please continue.
Okay. It was interesting to start with Paul's poll around cities and the images. There were 5 images, I don't know if you remember, in terms of how light they were, how dark they were. And those type of images are what's going to inform us in our practices. So what we have developed as part of UNESCO is an activity, a tool that we call Future Literacy Labs, with this idea that if it's a capability to approach the futures, then we do need tools in order to become more capable, more competent. Those labs are structured around 4 phases that allows us to explore different kind of futures: probable futures, preferred futures, reframed futures that are neither probable, neither preferable, with this idea that if we want to explore as many possible futures, we actually need to explore them and do it along the way. There's a mix of objectives in how we do it. There's the theme. So for example, one of the labs that we organized was on the future of Libreville, and I'm glad to have some people that were involved in that project amongst the participants so that we can actually have them talk about that a little bit more and explain the genesis of the project itself, working with the City Council of Libreville. And the idea is that we had a theme, which was the future of Libreville. That being said, we also understood that we didn't want for only specialists to talk about those. We also wanted for people that are actually living in Libreville to talk about the future of Libreville itself. And what was important for us was 2 things. The first one was around expectation management. What can we achieve through a future literacy lab that is a once-off event as part of a 5-day course? But the other one is also, if we base ourselves on people that are not specialists of where the structure of the city, the history of the city, the morphology of the city, what can we actually get from them? And this is a negotiation as part of the process, and I believe that some of you that are directly involved in working with cities would be keen to know more about this tension that exists. Because if you're democratizing the future, then you do need to know who's part of all of this. So the future of Libreville, what we had done was that we had 30 participants that were youth from different backgrounds, just all living in Libreville, that were exposed to the different uses of future, exposed to future literacy and what it actually could mean. And they were going through those 4 phases. They had the opportunity to talk about Libreville in 2050, the way they project their own images of the future. Based on that, we built a community of practice that is still, to present day, still alive. So the project was in December. And what was interesting is that COVID actually struck us earlier this year. And we could see what this community could be about. They started launching activities around fighting myth around COVID, such as Black people that could not get COVID, which was something that was very present directly in Libreville. And we got to see how changing those images of the future, where they're not only waiting for the government or for the city council to respond, but actually key actors of Libreville and the future of Libreville itself, and how that led them to feel more comfortable to present ideas as part of a community that shared the same ideals. And that's the type of conversation that we're trying to have through futures. So less focus on what the future should be, and a lot more about what the present is, and how the adaptation of the different images of the future that we have can actually be reflected in the present that we hold. And moving forward, that's kind of like the approach that UNESCO wants to support around the democratization of the future. That's for one. So not only leaving that in the hands of specialists, but actually engaging in conversation as an overall that allows for people to actually share their own values, share meanings, and just talk, because that's really the key conversation that we have. And moving forward with discussion around cities, probably that's a move that we see more and more cities. I'm thinking about Boaké, for example, in Ivory Coast, that are interested in having those conversations more directly, just to make sure that they don't miss out on new ideas. And if we think about the definition of innovation and how it's still difficult for societies to innovate and actually just situate themselves in space, maybe it's both related to space and time. And engaging in discussions around futures is just about that, having spaces for learning, spaces for creation that can tap into different dimensions of time and space. So I'll just end on that note, just before diving into questions. And what I'll be keen to hear from you is both how you've been tapping into this notion of representation of futures, representation within the cities that we have, but also a plurality of perspectives, and how you invite that as part of the mix, as we've been trying to do that working with cities directly at UNESCO.
Great, thank you, Cuomo. We are going to try something a bit novel for a webinar, where normally we're hoping questions are emerging, and I've seen a few come in. But I think we're going to be quite purposeful about creating space to articulate a question or a comment. So as participants in the webinar, we hope you will join us in reflecting on these three provocations. And we're going to put up a screen and play a little bit of music for about 2.5 minutes. And if you can take that time to reflect on what you've heard and put a comment or a question into the Q&A, that would be wonderful. And in addition, if you go through some of the questions, there's a wonderful ability to upvote. And so we'll take 2.5 minutes to do this now, and then answer a few of them before we dive into an interactive discussion led by Cuomo Eva. Great. Thank you all for sharing some questions. I think we can start with one voiced by Stephen Lichty. How does Cuomo see complexity studies intersecting with futures literacy in regard to African cities? Cuomo, would you be able to share your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. And I also see that there's some questions that got answered by Geshe, so she might also want to jump on those. But while I'm at it, I'll just dive into this question directly. For complexity studies, let me start with what Ria was just mentioning in terms of complexity as being the dominant paradigm and where we are currently evolving and what it actually means. If we believe that we are diving into complex systems and that human beings themselves are complex systems, and cities as the reflection of human activities or complex systems in themselves that cannot be defined just by the buildings that we have or by the fact that we have water systems in place as being just a definition of what a city can be about, then that would mean that our approach to cities has to be, first of all, interdisciplinary, that it has to be participatory, just to make sure that we do get to hear from everybody who makes sure that the city comes to be. But then in terms of images, it also means that we should be open to the notion of emergence. It means that we cannot foresee what cities were actually going to be about, if we even think about what cities used to mean in the Empire of Mali more than 1,000 years ago, it's not the same definition of current cities as we know them today for the rest of the continent. Even we don't even have to go so far in history. Even like today, if we observe the city of Niamey, who's one of my favorite, and the city of Yaoundé, where I'm from, the meaning of what that city means is just totally different in terms of the interaction, what kind of rituals actually animate that society. It means that we should be open to the fact that there's purpose, meanings that we have not anticipated upon that actually come to existence today and will come to existence tomorrow. And this openness is actually what defines our resilience. And we've seen it even more today with, of course, COVID, because it's difficult not to mention COVID, obviously, as there's items that were there in the air to which we're defining meaning. I'm thinking, for example, about how for the longest time, when it comes to informal economy, we used to actually believe that we need to formalize African economies. Now, 2 years ago, UN Women came up with a report realizing how the role of women was actually undermined by the formalization of our economies, because how overly present men were in the formal economy, while women were actually a lot more present in the informal economy. And this type of realization of the implications of just one policy that was not gender specific, but observing those gender implications would have been a lot more easier if we had had more people engaged in those conversations. And what we see with future literacy activities that we organize around that is that we tend to not only have policymakers involved in those discussions, but also have other people who have different images of the future, not only liberate their images of the future that were sometimes not always their own, and actually express others that they had it within them, but were not given the space to actually express. But we also get to have a dialogue with those very same policymakers that get to hear about images of the future that they have never heard before.
Thanks, Eva. We have two somewhat similar questions and a few along this theme. Are futures shaped by current or existing ideologies, such as socialism and capitalism? If so, should they be? From Linda van der Meij. And Marcel Zimmerman on, does the political system of the society not determine how open we can be, or inherently how closed the approach for future planning can be? The power of planning is usurped by the political system it is undertaken with. So he says we give planning too much power, which planning actually does not have to. I don't know if Riel, you want to respond to those two thoughts?
Well, just to be glad to chip in on that. I mean, the issue that I want to try and raise is the distinction here between intentionality or agency. In other words, there are certainly societies that have attempted to inhibit change and to repress openness. There's no doubt about that, often at a terrible, terrible cost. But there's also the clear examples of where that's been attempted, and it's pretty much generated the opposite or unexpected results. And it's I think the distinction I want to draw here is between the adaptive, evolutionary, resilient diversification analytical description of what's taking place in a society, and then the intentionality and the role of agency that we have. The suspension of change is a relatively limited duration. It can be attempted, but it doesn't succeed for very long on an intentional basis, which is to distinguish it from, I think, a non-intentional basis, which might be in, for instance, Australian Aboriginal society that could be characterized as having been stable for 30,000 years, but stable on the basis of not saying, oh, we must preserve least this is my perception of it, but rather saying the way we are is the way we will be in 10,000 years. And that departs quite radically from the ideological version, whether it's fascist, communist, or whatever, which says we believe that we can achieve some future state which will be better, whether it's a racist society or a communist, egalitarian society, or whatever it happens to be, which is very much about progress and engineering the future. So I guess here again, I would just want us to be able to distinguish between the role of agency and how we construct our concept of agency, and how complex emergent evolutionary systems, which are the ones that we have in the world around us, function. So I think that's just an important thing for us to clarify.
I mean, I think that sets us up well for the next phase of the webinar, which will be an interactive game around some of those questions. Just one final thought that maybe Geshe can react to from Yusuf Adam. Is there really a difference between what African cities face compared to most cities in developing countries? Are not these characteristics in common? So do we need separate or different futuring approaches in them? I think that resonates with a number of questions about some of the characteristics in African cities, such as informality, and how do we harness that in our futuring processes?
Yeah. So I was just trying to get that. Is it whether they are different from other developing countries or other developed countries?
Is there a difference between African countries compared to most cities in developing countries? In
developing countries, okay. Look, I think every city is different. So in fact, often when we talk about African cities, also in this broad category, we are on the same landmass. In that sense, we're similar. But I think many of us on the continent are also acutely aware that, and I can even just use South Africa. There's a big difference between even Johannesburg and Pretoria, which is a city next door, almost seemingly joined. But there are many, whether it's geographical, cultural, there are a whole bunch of things that are different. So I'm a very big proponent, and I know Riel and Eva are too, for really the hyperlocal, for really appreciating that every place is different, and in that sense, I think has to take stock and make sense of itself within its context. So I would answer that way. I guess if the question is Africa in general versus other places in the South, their characteristics, I do think the issue of thinking about and using the future is relevant everywhere. I think the conditions in some cases perhaps are particular, just as they may be in different parts of Asia or in different parts of Latin America. I've lived and I've worked in several different African cities, and I think in our crowd of 90 people here, I'm sure we've all got experience with various ones, and we'll be aware of some specificities that are worth looking at. And I think that's what's beautiful, and that's what's exciting, and that's what scares me the most sometimes with these very sterile, still visions, that sometimes when you look at those renderings, and I referred to some earlier in the intro, they all look like they could be the same place. There's this kind of neutralization of context. So when Riel talks about inventing or doing anything new, I think what I'd really like to see invited and embraced is the idea that means something. And that's, I think, also difficult to speak about even in as broad a category as saying African cities. So I really welcome and I revel in the idea that as we begin doing this and thinking about this, that some of these conversations, some of the reflection, and certainly the work becomes more and more localized. I gave an example to somebody the other day that I really look forward to the day that I go from one city to the next, even in the country I reside in right now, where the places look different because they're different. And where the aspirations of those places are different because they're different. And so, yeah, I think that would be my response. I do think there's a danger, obviously, in the, being over, the exceptionalism, can be an issue. And I think African cities and African urbanization and Africa's demographics and Africa's youth, some of these exceptionalisms do carry a certain burden. But I think the invitation in that is to also look deeply into context, and I welcome that.
Great. Thanks everyone for the thoughtful responses. We're going to dive in, and I'll hand over to Eva to guide us through this facilitated process. I see someone has raised a hand, and we will definitely want your voices to add to this after a few minutes. So Eva, please over to you and guide us with the polls.
Yes. So the idea as part of this webinar was not to just have you listen to us, but we're very keen to get you to experiment a little bit futures. So we're going to play a game that we call the Pollock game. That some of you may know. If you don't, it's fine. I'll just explain in a minute. For the next 20 minutes, the idea is, and I encourage you to really participate and do not hesitate to ask any questions in the chat. We read it regularly. So what I ask you to do is actually to close your eyes just for a few seconds and to think about yourself in 2050. As you open your eyes, and you don't have to do it now, I just want for you to locate yourself and tell me whether you believe that African cities were actually good places to live in, or just the contrary. There's a possibility for you to have some kind of nuance around that. So you see the axis that is on your screen. I'd like for you to answer a poll that is just going to launch in literally 30 seconds, where you locate yourself. As A, if you believe that African cities are really not good places to live in 2050, or I, if you actually believe that they're really great places to live in. And depending on how nuanced your response is, just feel free to answer C, D, E, whatever you would like. And as you answer, so we're just going to give you 40 seconds more to just answer. Please bear in mind the letter that you had used. We'll need it also in about a minute. Thank you. The slide is going to change, so please do bear in mind the letters. Okay. I'm going to ask you another question. Paul, would you mind changing the slide? Great, thank you. There's the next one, great. Now, keeping the letter that you initially had, or the position that you had, I'd like for you to tell us if you believe that you're able to affect that future, or if you actually do not believe that you have a say in the future. You will also have a poll where you're supposed to situate yourself. For example, A1, if you believe that African cities are not good places to live in 2050, but you are able to affect that future. Or E5, if you believe that they're good places to live in, but you do not believe that you can affect that future. So same thing. A poll must have started on your screen. Just pick one. You can go back to the slide itself by moving it to the side to actually see the exact letters. The question is, where do you stand? Do you have issues seeing the poll? Paul, I think that maybe there might be an issue with the poll itself.
We'll relaunch it now. I wonder if people have to respond to every one of them.
There's an issue with the poll. It's not allowing people to submit. What we
let's end the poll, and maybe people can share.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah,
what I'd like
I'll try to edit in the background. Sorry, Emma.
Yeah, cool. What I'd like for you to do then, we'd like for you to invest a chat and kind of explain why you have opted for B3, D2, E1, D5, or A5, just to get a sense of where you're at. So feel free, we'll give you just about 3 minutes, once again, to just write in the chat, and I'll love to read your answers directly in the chat. And if you can give your position, but also explain your position as well, that would be helpful. Thanks, Louise. Very nice. Just giving 30 additional seconds for those who still wish to share their ideas directly in the chat to do so. Do not hesitate, because that's what we're building on, to actually share thoughts and reflection. thank you so much for sharing. And while some of you might keep on sharing directly in the chat, I do want to bounce back on some of the ideas that are already there. I added the names that I could see, but sometimes I couldn't see your name. So even though I took your ideas into consideration, I couldn't edit and annotate the slide directly. I'll go back probably to the aim of the exercise. So you see some of those ideas, some that are related to agency. The fact that the question itself was also a bit bizarre because it's about good places, bad places, even though we're not quite sure of what a good place is supposed to be about. And I could read in the chat this idea that good place is probably doesn't mean the same thing for everyone. In a sense that maybe it could be a good place for some, but not a good place for others. We could hear earlier discussions around the notion, for example, of disabilities, and I could see that in, as part of the questions that we had in the chat, whether there was ways to actually not only include people with disabilities in the conversation, but actually have cities that reflect everyone that is part of the society, which includes obviously people with disabilities. In that sense, we see that all of those questions kind of emerge just through a very simple gains. The notion of policy making, decisions that are taken. There was this idea that decisions are actually something that are external to us. I could read in the chat one of you that was typing into this idea that yes, I do want to affect the future, and I believe that I have the ability to affect the future, but in one way or another, there's limitations that come from external forces. So there was mention made to corruption, policy, Western thinking that I could see, the role of politicians that I'm also seeing emerge just right now in the chat section. So in terms of positioning oneself in the future, there's this idea that is not only about a time, that is like I gave you 2050 as the time frame that we're evolving in, but we see that all of those ideas that are on the floor are about relationality. It's about how we interact with other actors, and it's not even about I as in like me, my ego, but also about what kind of negotiation is taking place, and that's really where the power of futures can be. And I see that there's even more comments. I'm also trying to update what I'm saying to the new information that we get. And that's the power of those kind of smaller exercises. What I'd like to take on, just before we take on questions and dive into a format that might be more conventional for this type of event, I'd like to also hear from you on how you see this type of exercise reflecting your practice. So you can use the chat section or the questions and answers section to actually target that. But we already see the potential that it emerged from there. Maybe Riel and Geshe, you might want to jump in and actually build on some of the ideas that you can read in the chat as well. Geshe and Riel?
Yeah, just trying to unclutter my screen. There's lots going on. It's fascinating, fantastic. I just wanted to one of the points that I wanted to raise has to do with the diversity of anticipatory systems that came up in the chat and the Q&A, and just to point out that this kind of takes us slightly away from the four quadrants, but to say that there are many different kinds of anticipatory systems, including for single-celled organisms and trees and cats and dogs. So the issue here from an anticipatory systems perspective is to just be aware of the vast diversity. And so whether it's neo-humanist or transhumanist, or that's not so much the issue as to say that there are different ways and reasons for imagining the future. So that was a comment I wanted to make coming out of the Q&A.
Definitely around the sources of those images. So we could, in the different interventions that we just made with Geshe and Riel, there was indeed this idea of like where are those images coming from, but also this notion of feelings. What I could hear is that some of your responses were directly based on what you were doing directly on the ground. Some saying, well, I'm planning in my own city, so I see that I'm hands-on and I can actually do it. But then in relationship directly with the city itself and how the city comes to be, what's interesting is what kind of relationship are you actually building with different actors that are on the ground that are also shaping the city the same way you're doing it. But the very notion of shaping the city is also part of the difficulties that we have with discussions around futures, which is, are we actually doing the things that we believe that we're doing? And what we see in the way all of you actually, and I'll be keen to know more about what Marietje was thinking about, or Mariama made a longer comment, just to hear a lot more about why you believe that African cities were not good places to live in 2050, and what kind of agency you have in relationship with that. And in the meantime, guess you do not hesitate to jump in if you have also some ideas that you'd like to share.
Yes, and apologies for my silence. I'm typing away. I think some really interesting questions coming up. I don't have any comment to make right now, ever. I'll finish typing this thought and then I'll come back to the conversation.
And can I invite Mariama to unmute and share your thoughts? And then we can go to Mariki. Mariama, are you able to? Hi.
If you're speaking, you're on mute.
Yeah, it was a mute. So thanks for giving me the floor. I'm a bit afraid if my talk is a bit behind of the whole group, but I'm just making a comparison between what the local communities are living and where the decisions are taken. Because if I just take the current situation, I'm in West Africa, and I know that around March, April, we have the weather forecast from agreement that provide that we will have a good rainy season, that we will have a lot of water this year. And the decision maker did not try to implement anything behind. And we have a huge rain the last weekend, and Dakar is under the flood. And now they are trying to make the emergency plan. But for me, the emergency plan should come before, when they have the information that we will have. We all know that the weather forecast can come with a level of uncertainty, but at least we can have a sort of trend. And when we are trying to govern or to provide something for the community, for me, it's not focusing for the decision making, but during your speech, you was trying to see the how and how we can involve the local community. But on my point of view, we can involve the local community, it's good, but they do not have the power to make the decision. So in the future, if we want to plan something better than where we are standing today, how we can better give the power to the local community to better be involved in the decision maker, or give them the power to shape their future and do not wait for the decision maker. I know the decision maker will provide the frame, but sometimes how we can work with the local community to give them the power to shape their future, the future they want.
Ariel, you wanted to respond to that?
Yeah, if I might, I think just these are very crucial questions, but there's two different aspects to this, and one has to do with preparation and contingency, and the other has to do with planning and trying to make something to achieve a certain objective. So the difference is important, but it also is worth keeping in mind that the world doesn't unfold in that way, which was the point about the walking on two legs. And so it's even more than that. I mean, obviously, planning to go someplace or do something is important, and we make bets all the time. Sometimes people make good bets, sometimes they make bad bets. And contingency or preparedness, you know, if I say, I want you to get ready for bzz, and you say, but what is that? You say, and I don't know, because it's unknowable. There's no way to prepare for it. The point, the example that you're giving, which is also something that's true about the current COVID crisis, is that people are saying, well, why didn't we do something, because we knew that pandemics happen to humans on a regular basis. We know that floods can happen, and we even have warnings that floods will happen. And very often we see all sorts of examples of where humans make bets that, and here they're speculating on contingency, that it won't hit now, or that they don't want to spend resources being prepared because it means they can't do other things in the present. And I have to say that it, you know, it's not, I'm not trying to make a judgment or be callous here, but given that we can't be certain, these are questions of values and choice societies. And so I think you point to, I think to the answer that's the most relevant, which is the way to do this properly is to give communities an awareness. And right now, there's not a lot of awareness. This is what futures literacy is about. There's not a lot of awareness about the choices we're making when it comes to using the future and how the future is used in different ways. And communities can be very risk averse. And that's about contingency planning. And they'll prepare for earthquakes and fires and hurricanes, and they will get hit by a plague, which they didn't prepare for. They can be very planning oriented and build big defensive castles, and then somebody comes along with cannons and breaks all the castles down. And so, these are choices that I think need to be much more transparent and much more, as I think you're suggesting, community driven. So that's again about capability and capacity building as the way humanity relates to the world around us, without trying to pretend that we can be gods or that we can control the world, but rather just understanding the world better and understanding ourselves better, and finding more avenues to express that understanding.
And I see, as you were talking, that some more ideas were also coming on the floor. This idea, and we've heard it a lot around like the role of local communities, and also when we talk about cities, what cities are we actually talking about? For example, is it about primary cities, thinking about capitals, but are we also addressing issues around secondary cities? I think one of the easy answer that we can give, what we're interested in from like the point of view of futurist, is how the methods that we use or the approach that we take can actually allow for more conversations around that to actually emerge. For example, Solofina was asking questions earlier on whether it was the formal economy part of the future African city that we want, or some of the aspects of the informal economy that we want, such as flexibility, inclusiveness, amongst others. And one of the easy answer to that question that is actually not so easy is that, of course, it's difficult to see if it's the system that we want or its characteristics. But the fact that we're having the conversation and questioning things that sometimes just goes unquestioned because they're simply assumed, allow us to actually get to understand where they're situated. And for example, what was interesting about the informal economy is that it is built on a larger system that we usually have forgot to think about, which is a solidarity system where the locality, the proximity of the actors allows them to also interact from a more social basis. So for example, if we're thinking about the pension system as part of the nation state that is built on the fact that you pay your taxes, and this way, since we know for how long you've paid your taxes, we're also able to compensate you later on as you're done working the right amount of time. You get to actually receive a monthly stipend for your past services. Now, if you think about the informal economy and this relationship in terms of proximity and what we call in Francophone Africa, for example, de tontine, which is this idea of every month somebody we're going to give 10,000 CFA franc to this general pot, so that by the end of, let's say, 10 months, you'll be able to gather 100,000 CFA franc that will go directly in your bank to support projects that you have, maybe a wedding or a heavy project that you have, buying a car or you name it. And this system is also going to influence the fact that you will be able to be sustained by your local community were you to get sick. And so we understand that, in fact, the informal economy is not only about you buying, hot corn around the corner, but it's also about how people interact as part of the society. And it's not to say that it's necessarily the society that we want in 2050, but it's to allow discussions around purpose that we usually do not dive into. And so that's what I see as part of the strengths around those conversations that we had around futures, that we realize that we come up with a theme initially, for example, when we talk about the future of Libreville, or we had a session on the future of human mobility from a youth perspective in Marrakesh. And we end up thinking that maybe the entire discussion was not so much about human mobility the way we see it, especially in Morocco in the mid-2010s, which is of course about this idea of migration and how to contain migration, but much more about what it means to be free, what kind of interaction, what do we get from meeting other people. And so that's really the type of conversation that we're trying to have, that will enable us to actually get more people, more actors into the conversation, just because they are part of the story that we're trying to tell. Moving forward, I'll be keen, Geshti, I don't know if you're done answering the different questions that you could see, but I'd be keen to also hear your thoughts on that, because you are the one obviously working a lot around cities in South Africa.
Eva, I wonder if we can invite a few further participants who've placed themselves to explain sort of their thinking behind their placement, because we'll have a closing reflection from yourself, Riel and Geshi, for the whole webinar. I'd be very interested in maybe Louise or Shandan or Miriki, or maybe some of the E1s to reflect. Who would you like me to offer to unmute?
I think what would be great is for anyone who actually wants to dive and speak, since you'll need to give them rights to speak from like a technical perspective. Would you mind directly answering in the chat and just say if you want to speak?
You can raise your hand.
Yeah, also.
On the participant panel, you can click raise hand button.
I think we had, Solofina had made a few comments, so I suspect that she would be also keen to speak, but I don't want to volunteer everyone, so just let me know also. But Solofina, for example.
Okay, I see a hand from Reed Harvey.
Please, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
we can.
Oh, good. I'm Reed Harvey. I'm a ceramic industrial designer in Niagara Falls, New York, in the US. And I'm focused on environmental health and development. As it happens, all over sub-Saharan Africa and the developing world, there are those who produce such simple clay products as water containers, cook pots, and construction brick. They do that by hand forming. They are already skilled, knowing what kinds of clay are appropriate, how to process the clays, and how to form these products. Once they get capacity building in simple mass production techniques, they will be able to produce ceramic water filters coated with a small amount of silver. Let's say the local high school chemistry teacher can help with that. And insulating ceramic rocket stoves that give no smoke and burn biomass or agri-waste. But importantly, the processes implicit will enable a wide array of ceramic products that are at the origin of industry. The resources are everywhere. Once there is capacity building, it will be possible to get livelihoods, innumerable livelihoods will be made possible using local resources. Thank you. I'm on a soapbox.
Thanks, Reid. Would anyone like to explain their position, their choice? You can either raise your hand, otherwise, if possible, I can call on Shandan or Louise if you're still with us. I think, Sophia
I
Bazil.
invited Mauricio, so to speak, and I see that somebody has voluntold her as well.
Hello?
Hi, Sophia.
Hi. Yeah, I decided that I am optimistic about African cities are becoming, being good places to live in 2050, because I think that we have a lot of very interesting conversations happening right now, and there's a lot of movement in different communities, and I think there's a greater appreciation for how we are all stakeholders in tapping into Africa's untapped potential to really thrive. And I put it in D2 in the middle just because I feel like I do have some sense of agency in this as a member of the African diaspora, as a member of the human race. But at the same time, there are various narratives going on about who is investing in African cities and how that will eventually play out. For example, China is a large investor in a lot of African countries, and there's different ideals and philosophies that come along with using the resources provided by different countries at this point. Am I right? I think so. It's interesting to see how it'll play out and what the potential is in terms of who besides Africans is going to help themselves make some progress and become cities that are sustainable and promote flourishing in all areas.
Very nice, and thanks for sharing those views. Maybe would like to welcome two more ideas or opinions on the floor. So now that we invited Mauricio, if you were speaking, you're on mute, just so you know. And the same thing goes for Marcel that I saw that was invited. Be keen to hear also for Stacy Lee from Clotilde, from Shandan. Really, the floor is yours.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Hey, Keenan, go ahead.
Hi there, my name is Keenan Burgess. I'm a architectural technologist, a recent graduate. I think I'm on more of the younger side of the guys in this room at the moment. I've opted for E1, so very positive, outlook on life, and obviously working towards it. I think that by 2050, with all of the aiding countries that are currently trying to help our country reach our goals for 2030, if we reach half of those targets that other countries have already listed as problems in our country or in Africa, then we'd be working towards a very good, solid 2050. And given my position in the architectural field, my effort is as much as I can put in. So I try and convince everybody, I try and talk about it, I try and make it as real as it should be. But essentially it comes down to what people can afford and how affordable is it to be sustainable in South Africa. Me being a 30-year-old at the moment, I can tell you now already, it's not easy to afford the sustainable hemp materials to build and to do all the things. But I hope that as we move forward in towards the future, it'll become easier for our local markets to produce sustainable materials that we can build with, instead of sticking to what we've been taught by other countries in the beginning of time. So yeah, just my opinions on the future. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Keenan. And before we hand over to Stacey Lee, I think put her hand down again, Marike has commented, community context matters. Not everyone has the same opportunities, and if you do not have access to opportunities, it does not give you much hope that you can continue living in an African city. Resources are not distributed evenly, and it's challenging. And I think that is to reflect on the A2 positioning. Eva, shall we take one more from Alex? Alex, the floor is yours if you unmute.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Alex. I'm from the Congo. I see a lot of good future for Africa at the moment, because I see there's a good change and good chance for us to do changes. We have a lot of potential resources which everybody wants. We just need to put ourselves in a position where we can redirect the people coming in about what we want and where we want to go with it. But if we want to continue, like I see, unfortunately, that we are still looking at Europe as a model, though they themselves, they are changing the direction at the moment. So we need to kind of try to change our direction and try to look back where we are coming from. And unfortunately, like I live in a country where we have not many people who are city planners or educated in city issues. So this is where I think we need to focus a lot, and this kind of talk can reach very far. So I think we should. I will suggest that this kind of meetings go deeper in educating more people, so that we get there. And I hope by 2050 we'll be in a better position. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That's a very nice, hopeful perspective to cause our conversation on. I wonder if Eva can offer a reflection to this process and the webinar, and then we can hand over to Reel and Geshe for their closing reflections.
Yes, very nice. Paul, can you just clarify if we expect someone's position, because what you read from Maurizio was actually her comment in the chat, and I just wanted to clarify if she was speaking or not.
She won't be speaking. She has her child writing exams next to her, as the COVID experience has shaped a lot of changes for us. Definitely. Thanks for being here while that's all going on, Marike.
Definitely, and thanks for also adding just another layer of perspective on these issues when it comes to the notion of opportunities. What we tend to see, so I'm very glad that we took on this exercise and we had the opportunity to actually think about futures. What I'd like to just say is that initially we had thought of the game slightly differently. Wanted to dive into questions around the morphology of the city, if cities are supposed to be vertical, horizontal, thinking about the notion of unfairness and injustice as part of the cities, and then to ask you about your own sense of agency. Now, what we tend to see as part of the answers and responses that we get from all of you, and once again, thank you so much for sharing, is really this idea that the future holds feelings, that the way we are as individuals, the profession that we have, but also the experiences that we have around cities, just as people living in cities, maybe for most of you, if not all of you, what we see is that this kind of determines the way we project ourselves in the future, or the other way around, should we put it that way. What you do today has direct influence on the images of the future that you build. And if you believe that it is the future that you'd like to reach, then there is a need to actually question what those images are actually composed of. And what we could hear sometimes was the fact that we're not so sure if there was a specific image in mind, a reflection of what the city actually looks like, before we come up with this kind of comments. And so diving into those type of exercises, we're actually questioning what are the different actors in place, what role can I play as an individual, what role can my community play, or another community that I've heard of can play in those discussions. It's definitely what we're trying to tap into. And when we're talking about the role of space travel, talking about mobility and time travel, talking about the role of futures, the combination of the two is actually what's moving forward, is something that we're trying to dive into. I'll just end by mentioning, so what we mean by Futures Literacy Labs, which are the activities that we're organizing in order to become more competent, more futures literate. Those activities are action learning, action research tools that are structured around the span of 1 to 4 days, that are there to actually dive into different kind of futures. The objectives are determined by those that actually co-design those labs. So it's both futurists, so it could be Geshe, it could be Riel, it could be myself, and what we call local champions, people that are actually interested in using futures in their own constituency and getting a sense of, what is expected, what do they want to take it to. So it can be building the strategy, it can be about having different people that they're not used to engage with, talk about the future of a specific theme. For example, one that I'll be facilitating tomorrow is on the future of activism and what that actually means for an organization that is not so much of an activist organization in the first place, but how activism not in itself, but the questions that emerge from them related to how does it mean to be an active citizen can actually inform their practice as a center or as an institute. So that's the type of conversation that can be had. But then it's obviously up to all of you to then come up with actions around the city of tomorrow. Maybe Riel and Geshe, if you want to actually close the, I don't know which one of you is more comfortable coming next, but I'd be keen to hear from you as well. And once again, thank you so much for participating in the polite game. I believe that we can close this slide after taking pictures of it, which I have.
I can go first so that the white man can go last. For
Thanks for that. Yeah, there you go. Okay, just reinforcing the ageism.
No, that was Keenan. Keenan called us old. Keenan, I heard you. No, I'm just kidding. This has really been interesting for me, and I hope you're all finding the conversations interesting. I was answering questions in the Q&A, so I was quiet for a lot of it. But a lot of what comes out is, in a way, the same things I feel that in my career are the same kinds of concerns I think many of us as practitioners in the space have, right? I mean, you come up against questions of power, ideology, capital, all of these things that seem so big and overwhelming. It's actually impressive, I think, this graph we're looking at here, that at least the majority feel above the horizon of agency, at least into that sort of space. And there we can have conversations about what we think. But often I think there's a sense of feeling stuck in trying to drive whatever change or participate in whatever ways we think we are in various aspects, I guess, of what we might term development. And when we talk about the future of cities and thinking about our roles in it, I did find myself many times working in the biggest of institutions where one would assume that the power to make those calls resided, where you really begin getting this niggling thought that you're either busy doing the wrong things right or the right things wrong, but you're not quite sure. You're making changes that feel right. And what I find useful, and I really do hope that we go into this next stage of doing Futures Literacy Labs, because what I have seen, I'm experienced in participating in FL labs and being much more conscious in how I think about the future, is this power, not necessarily to find hope or solutions to the future, but really being in a more generative space where you feel you're asking better and better questions. And perhaps, you know, and Eva spoke about this kind of reflexivity in our work. And I think that's something quite valuable to do. So I think I have found this in my practice to be useful. The city, in whatever form it is, I think does depend on a whole range of actors. And then you can go in any city anywhere in the world and recognize that. So it's not just what the professional planner does or wishes. It's not just what the most powerful person in the city determines. It's not just what capital. It's all of those things, but it's a lot more. And I think that idea that reflexivity might matter and that we can encourage that at all levels. So I'm hoping that if we do these labs, that there's a range of participation. Because to me, that's the power in the democratization, right? It's not necessarily about driving, it's not about creating new ideology, for example. I think somebody asked the ideology question, and those are important questions to ask, but I think it is this idea that there's a conversation, a social conversation we can begin to have, and that we can begin to be more reflexive about questions and actions in the present. I do find that often in those processes in the labs, what one does begin to do as well is get much more, in a strange way, much more aligned as you get closer to the core of what we're actually trying to do as humanity. And that's a really...
Talk to everybody or only the panel?
Yes, she talked to everyone.
Hi there.
Hi, sorry, let me...
No, that's okay. Probably a good indication that I should hand over to Riel now. But yeah, I think that's just my reflection. I didn't get to answering all of the questions. I'll see if I can get to a few more. But thank you so much for all the engagement. I think, yeah, big, difficult questions, can't respond to them all. I've tried to give a few references, but really thankful to Ikli for opening the platform for this kind of conversation. I'm in many conversations about cities, and I think there aren't many that begin to ask this question, so quite excited about it. Thank you.
Real, some
thank you.
thoughts.
Yes, me too. Very, very glad to have been part of this, and very appreciative of the contributions and the initiative as an experiment, which is tribute to the ongoing spirit of our times in a way. But the thoughts that came to my mind, and I put them up in the chat, are that what happens when we start to think about organizing life for work instead of work for life? I mean, and what happens now when we begin to see that the version of globalization that has been dominant up to now was essentially the imperial colonial version, which called upon international standards for aviation and container ships as the way to deal with supply chains and voyeuristic entertainment tourism. Could flip towards something that's really significantly different, and that the kind of chink or the kind of little fissure in the dominant imaginaries is an important event taking place now, and that you know, that the mixture of envy and horror that is Gotham can perhaps begin to fade a little bit in the way that we imagine human well-being, and different and as of yet really uninvented versions of perhaps nomadism, or humanity having a light footprint and one that's not kind of homogeneous and uniform across the entire globe, moving more into what people begin to see as doable, livable in their own context. So I detect and I perhaps want that conversation to continue as the world seems to be trying desperately to return to some form of normal, or the so-called normal in the past. So I'm just seeing this and feeling this as an ongoing effort to open up the future and to take advantage of the hugely transformative potential of the present, which is always there, and in that sense, appreciating complexity. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Riel, for ending us off on that note. And that is certainly our aim, is to continue this conversation. I think this might sort of represent one of our more formal forays into futuring as ICTY Africa. But under the banner of Rise Africa, our mandate is certainly to explore what future African cities actually mean, what actions we can take to move us towards what those meanings are, and to do it with many members of society across sectors and across roles. So while ICTY Africa is very much in support of local government members, Rise Africa is seeking many of the connections with private sector, civil society, and academia for a rich conversation, to which all of you have now participated. So if we go to our next slides, I'd like to share just a few upcoming sessions. I see our annotations are cleared. Okay, to our next slide, I'm going to throw a few things into the chat. Next week, Tuesday, ICLEI, the African Capital City Sustainability Forum, and Rise Africa will be hosting a webinar to reflect on the experiences responding to COVID-19 in the Western Cape, Africa's first epicenter, and we're very excited to have reflections from the Western Cape Premier, Alan Winda, and the Mayor, Dan Plato of Cape Town. So we do invite you to join this. I've thrown the registration link into the chat and we'll email it with the recording afterwards. And then after that, we're continuing with our roadmap to hopefully a form of physical or hybrid event next year. But October is going to be African Mobility Month, and we invite you to join our webinar on mobility and the question of inclusivity, which we're hoping to challenge and explore more what is meant by inclusive mobility. So that'll take place on the 6th of October. So again, I'd like to thank our brilliant speakers. I've been getting WhatsApps in my phone saying this is wonderful. And I'm very excited for this conversation to continue as we proceed. So I wish everyone a wonderful day further, and we'll see you next time.
Many thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks a lot, Paul.